Good evening. I'm John Bailey. Tonight, you've got, on People to Be Heard, Dr. Howard Smith, Acting Superintendent of Schools for the White Plains School District. His exit interview, he's only going to be with us about another week.
Yep.
And then he departs. So we thank you, Howard Smith, for coming on and discussing your whirlwind tour of the White Plains District.
Happy to be here.
Yeah. Dr. Smith has had a distinguished career in public school administration, and he retired in 2013 from the superintendent position in the Union Free School District of the Terrytowns after 12 years as superintendent there, right? And since then, he has held interim superintendent and consultant positions. He has also been on the adjunct faculty at Bank Street College, Fordham University, and St. Lawrence University. A Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Marietta College, Dr. Smith has 2 master's degrees and a PhD from Teachers College, Columbia University. On October 1, he took over for interim superintendent Timothy Connors in White Plains through June 30th of this year. In his months with the district, he came in and hammered out a school budget and negotiated a settlement with the White Plains school teachers in 2 months that will last the next 2 years, one of the quickest contracts we've ever heard of in this town. So, Dr. Smith, could you explain why you were able to negotiate a 2-year contract with the teachers in 2 months? What made the difference?
Well, we began actually a little earlier than that with some informal conversations. So we kind of set the parameters. So when we really sat down to bargain seriously, for example, we already knew we were looking at a 2-year agreement, ideally. And we already knew that because we were kind of in a transition period with a new superintendent coming in and so forth, we weren't going to get into a major restructuring of the contract or anything like that, that it would boil down primarily to compensation and some cleanup issues. So having agreed that that was kind of our narrow focus, it really, I think, set the stage for moving forward fairly quickly and efficiently.
Right. You see major contract issues down the road?
There are always going to be issues that you can get into with any teacher's contract. Particularly in New York State, teachers' contracts are mature documents, and they represent accumulation of a lot of issues that were relevant at a particular point in time, and then there comes a point in time when sometimes you look at it and say, well, is it still relevant today? And so there's always fertile ground if you want to get into things.
I see.
But I wouldn't pick out anything in particular.
No, so right now they should be very happy. They appear to be.
There was a very successful vote, by 400-something to 60-something, I think it was. So we're very pleased that the teacher membership seemed to feel that it was a good settlement.
Yeah. Why is this 1% step increase across all steps good for the district, the taxpayers, and the teachers?
Well, it recognizes, I think, it starts out by recognizing that there are, in the world of tax cap limitations, there are limits to what a district can do in terms of increasing the salary budget every year. They're built into the structure of the compensation model in contracts, so-called step movement, which not all teachers are eligible for. Once you get to the top, then that's it. You're there, and then you're subject to whatever increase is negotiated in any given contract cycle. But I think overall it represented a recognition of, again, constraints on just the capacity of the district to increase its budget beyond a certain amount. But by the same token, we looked at it in the context of other settlements in the region, and it turns out that a 1% adjustment is pretty average, pretty typical for settlements throughout the region.
Yeah. Now, the teachers that have been on staff already do get more than the 1%.
Teachers who have been, you get 1% plus the step movement until such time as you max out and hit the top. So that usually, in your about 15 years or so, then you are more or less at the top of the scale. Although you can get it move across the horizontally as a function of continuing to take graduate courses too. So there are a fair amount of opportunities built into the structure to advance your salary in addition to the 1% adjustment.
So what does it actually work out to? Say in the middle, if you've been here for
So if you've been here for a while with the 1% now, it's well, the step movement in general is more like maybe 3.5%, and then the 1% on top of that for those folks.
Right. Okay. So can you explain the paradox the tax cap presents to school districts? I see it as a paradox because if you cut spending and do not take all the increase you're allowed to, it hurts you the next year.
Yeah, you certainly need to have a full appreciation for not just what's happening to your district in that particular year, but the out-year implications of any decisions you make around the tax cap. And it's pretty much the way it works, that a district is penalized in the future if you don't take full advantage of whatever the formula says you have access to. And as we all know and have experienced from year to year, that can vary quite a bit. They started out by referring to it as a 2% cap, and it's rare that you actually end up with exactly 2%. It can be more or less for a variety of reasons.
Yeah. Are you expecting health care costs to increase sharply in the future? Is that why the increase in the health care portion that teachers pay was put in?
I think there are two factors there. The first one is there's still a lack of parity typically between what teachers in general tend to pay for health insurance and what people in the general workforce tend to pay in terms of just a percentage of cost. That didn't used to be the case, but over the years, it's evolved in that direction. So there's a little bit of just kind of catching up, if you will. I mean, from a union perspective, teachers' union perspective, they might not agree with this perspective, but from an administrative point of view, we kind of look at it as if you get to a point where the benefits are kind of outpacing the benefits of the people who are paying the taxes that support your compensation, then there's maybe it's time for some adjustment. So the first argument really has to do with kind of leveling up, getting closer to what would be typical for people in general workforce. But the other part of it is absolutely anticipating ongoing inflation. And of course, as we know right now, as we speak, there's still a lot of uncertainty, that's going to dictate what those increases are. But we can pretty much safely, guess that there will be significant increases into the future.
Okay. Now, switching gears to the ever popular controversy of assessment tests. What was your reaction to the state education assessment tests this spring?
I think the reaction that was shared to me in general, shared with me, was that there was a feeling that some of the questions were a little bit, the word fairer was used, maybe a little bit more appropriate in some cases to the age levels, and I think they're starting to recognize that, particularly when, for example, when you have English language learners, if you're not really careful with the words you choose, you can send a student inadvertently off in a unproductive direction, which will not help them answer the question because they kind of get a miscue on a word, whereas if you'd used a different word, they would have known it.
Is the answer simply to have two sets of tests? One for the English language learners and one for persons who are supposedly English language proficient.
Well, I think
why wouldn't they do that?
I think it starts with the fundamental premise underlying the tests that we use right now, which have to do with a set of standards. And if you're going to say we're going to do standards-based assessment, then there aren't multiple standards. There's only one standard. Okay. And certainly it's intended to sort of preserve the integrity of the standards at any given level. And the idea is to measure, how close a student can come to meeting those standards. I think and that's not necessarily, educators don't necessarily have a problem with that. Where we tend to get concerned is when kids and teachers are made to feel that they have to apologize for a set of circumstances like being an English language learner, which predictably would contribute to some difficulties, particularly in the earlier years before you acquire, a real working knowledge of the language.
And I think last year our elementaries did much better.
We're really
Reasonably,
seeing, yes, you're really seeing a lot of work has been done in the area of literacy, and when I went around in the classes, I was seeing the evidence of that. Teachers are getting increasingly proficient with some of the new methodologies that were brought in, which are essentially the kind of drawn from what the most sort of research proven kinds of approaches, and we definitely seeing evidence of that paying off.
So predicting the future now, we should see a slow improvement on the middle school tests as these new standards work through, as the elementaries come up into the 6th, 7th, 8th grades.
Absolutely.
Okay, well let's hope so. After all, we report on education because it is the most important thing you can do.
That's what we believe.
That's right. Now, opting out. Who did opt out in White Plains this year? We were lower than most districts across the state, only 16%, but still that was up a tad. But who did opt out? And have you gotten a handle on whether it was the least performing students that opted out, or was it across the board?
We don't have real good data in terms that would allow us to answer the last question, although we did arrange to do a little bit of just a very rough check, and everything that we could gather suggested that it was a pretty scattered mix of students, that it didn't represent. In other words, we had asked one of the statisticians who works with us to sort of do a simulation, running, different scenarios depending on opting out compared to what the results we got. And it turns out that there didn't seem to be any significant impact that we could determine on our scores for the students opting out. What we did see in terms of a trend was the older, as you went up the grades, there were more students opting out, and to some extent, by the time you hit 7th grade, there was a jump, and then 8th grade was where we had our concentration, and quite frankly, our feeling there was that was kind of an expression of the beginnings of adolescents kind of flexing their muscles and saying, wow, I actually have a choice. And, as long as I get my parents to back me up, then I don't have to take this test. What a wonderful feeling. So I think that was a lot of it for the 8th graders.
Well, yes, that's what we understood at the time, that there was a movement and the parents went along with that. But what would you say to parents thinking about opting their children out? Why is taking the tests important?
Well, I don't.
That's a loaded question.
Yeah, I don't know that the way that they're given or the amount of time we spend and so forth is as important as it's made out to be, quite frankly. So I respect parents who independently kind of make a judgment about that in terms of whether their children participate. I would say, though, that if you're going to have a system of measurement, then it's really in everybody's best interest to make sure that it reflects the participation of everyone. Otherwise, you don't know how to interpret the results. And also, we only use the information to try to help us match services to kids. So if we don't have the data on your child, that's one less piece of information we have to use when we're trying to figure out how can we best help the child.
Right. This is not the CIA testing your children. I think that's the point. It's only to help. Now, do you feel that by shortening the tests that the state education department will be making it easier, taking us back to the very liberal passing curves of 8 years ago?
Well, I'm sure
I would hope not.
There's a concern about, there's a reason why they were as long as they were. And so I'm sure that they're concerned about the potential implications of shortening them. But as long as they continue to be tied to a standard, and, these standards represent certain target levels of proficiency at the various grade levels, I think it'll be okay.
Yeah. Did you agree that the assessment tests did not test well?
I mean, it depends what you're testing for, right? And I would say, for example, in the area of math, which sometimes doesn't get as much attention as literacy, that for people who are really serious about math education, the tests actually have done a service in helping to illustrate that math is more than just adding up numbers or dividing numbers or what. It's more than computation. If you're going to truly, if you're not going to be a victim of the numbers in the world around you in terms of how they're calculated and so forth, you have to understand what goes into setting up a problem, figuring out how to solve it, making sure that you can come up with an answer that you can defend and you understand how you solved it. Yeah. Those are all good things, and I think, frankly, the assessments have prompted educators to spend a little bit more time in getting into some of the deeper layers when it comes to math.
You think that the Pearson, a worldwide testing provider, was just not familiar with America as far as testing goes?
Well, they clearly have shown, they've been on a learning curve, and the tests have changed quite a bit as a result. So I guess I'd like to think that at least they're factoring in what they're learning in terms of any test revisions that they need to make.
Yeah. Yes. Now, can White Plains parents feel confident their students are competent in English despite the poor scores last year?
When you go into the classroom and see what students are able to demonstrate on a daily basis, not just on a test that you take once a year, that does really inspire you with confidence. And just I was at graduation last night, and the graduation rate is strong. The students are meeting the state requirements for graduation. There are a number of students who are graduating with distinction, with honors, and that is a trend that seems to be growing. So I think, you have to also look at it. We like to say that it's not a sprint; it's a marathon. So for one, what happens in any one year isn't so much of importance as the cumulative effect over the school career.
Consistently trying to improve.
Yep. And giving students enough time to show that they can grow and develop.
I see. What? So we are graduating many more students in 4 years in high school now.
I think in general the trend is up, and even there, though, we have to be cautious about using just the 4-year graduation rate as the only benchmark. For example, I happen to believe it's a real credit to a school district that inspires enough commitment on the part of a student, particularly, let's say, a recent immigrant or a student who's an English language learner who just didn't have enough time or opportunity to get where they needed to get in 4 years, say, I'm coming back, and I'm not going to quit until I actually meet the graduation requirements.
That is so heartwarming. It really is. I mean, my daughter has had that experience in her new teaching career. Now, could you give us a review of the state language other than English requirement that requires the parent to have a choice of instruction if they have, or if you have 20% of any one language speaking other than English? Yeah. How is that going to be phased in the fall?
So when I came in, the district had just gone through a study process in looking at the full implications of those regulations, and confirmed that the application of them was likely to increase the number of parents who would be interested in more of a bilingual approach to education as opposed to treating it just as a supplementary, taking a half an hour a day type of English instruction approach. And the district had kind of confirmed its commitment to the dual language model as a way of going about that. And when you look at the numbers, it became very clear that, well, we weren't going to meet our responsibility under the regulations, or even, frankly, I think ethically, as far as knowing the demonstrated needs of the students, unless we expanded the dual language program. And so we moved forward with that process and ended up at Church Street School, where they've been working really for the whole second half of the year and getting ready to bring kindergartners in there for the first year of dual language in that school.
And then at the present time, that's going to continue for those kindergartners.
Right, you'll just
first,
1 year,
Second,
exactly. We'll build it along with them. Well, it doesn't necessarily require staff build-up, it requires reallocation because, and then, in fact, it's an important point to remind people that one of the beauties of the dual language program is that you're not hiring extra teachers, you're basically designating a teacher. Now, they have to have the right training, but you're designating a teacher who would have had a class at that grade anyhow. And instead of it being a general ed class, it's a dual language class. So the issue is just making sure you have on your staff, or when you do your hiring, people with the proper credentials, but it doesn't require extra staff.
But the 1% increase in all the step levels across the board gives you the flexibility to bring in new teachers if necessary.
But keeps you
lower
competitive.
Rate. Yeah, or competitive rates. Okay.
Yep.
I see. So you told me this year that when you came to the district in September, you said White Plains was in really good shape. Quote, "We can do things," unquote. Are we still in good shape? Can we still do things?
Well, that's the part where I'm a little jealous of the new superintendent coming in, because
you've set it up. You can't fail.
There really are a lot of good things going on that I've had a chance to get familiar with. But I've also got a sense that there's still some unrealized potential to be tapped. But this is a community that has stepped up and provided resources that, and so. We really can't use it as an excuse, quite frankly, that we don't have the resources to do things. We do have the resources. It's a matter of prioritizing and deciding where we want to put the emphasis in terms of taking things to the next level.
How is the new cabinet that is now in place that Dr. Ricca will inherit, what will their experience contribute to decisions made in the district for the future? This is a much younger cabinet than we've had, I think. Not much, but seasoned. But
they're all experienced educators, but they're mid-career folks. Yeah. And in fact, I was just talking with one of them today and remarking that they've all gotten to the point now where they've been through what I called the discovery phase. So
I see.
They figured out where they lifted up the rug a few places. They found where there's a little dust underneath there or whatever. They have a sense of what's working and what needs to be tweaked, so they're ready to go. They're kind of digesting that, and again, I think Dr. Rick will be able to come in and sit down with them and say, okay, based on what you've learned, and where let's really talk about a sense of direction and priority going forward.
Right. Now, what does Dr. Ricca, your successor, who begins in July, face in the key issues academically next year, which was really the ones we're really interested in, right? What does he face from your perspective? What would you be tackling and be wary of that you have obviously probably discussed with him?
Well, he'll know coming in that we need to monitor the ramp up of the dual language program and continue to plan going forward to meet the needs of students for bilingual education. We've talked this spring with the board was very interested in pausing for a moment with the various curriculum instruction initiatives that we've been involved in, and making sure that we had a really good evaluation model in place so that we could address the fundamental question of how do we know it works. So I know that he'll be working with our new Assistant Superintendent of Curriculum Instruction, Dr. Hand in particular, to make sure that that process moves forward and in putting the district in a position to be increasingly transparent about the evidence around various initiatives in terms of how well they're working. So that will be a significant undertaking. I'm reminded the board it's that we do that now, but it's not as transparent and it's not as formalized, and it takes an investment of time and resources to do that.
That would also include the evaluation tests that are used in grade to figure whether the students are really getting it.
Exactly.
Yeah, I've often thought that's what I can't understand about the assessment results from just looking at it, because but anyway. Now, how are the district buildings holding up? Is another bond issue in the future?
Well, when you walk through the buildings, you like to say that they've been well loved. They are remarkably clean and well maintained, and everybody notices that going through. At the same time, we did a capacity analysis, and they're pretty much maxed out in terms of their capacity to absorb any kind of enrollment growth. And there's some evidence to suggest that White Plains can continue to expect some modest growth in enrollment. We're certainly not declining. And there's some older facilities. And with every school district, particularly with older buildings, increasingly you find yourself in a situation where people are using spaces for purposes that they weren't necessarily designed for. Mm-hmm. So when you look at the bigger picture with your facilities, you want to make sure you don't lose an opportunity to do some redesign as well, so that in fact that when you're done, you can have spaces that better fit the purpose. A classic example would be just a room that's used for music that's just a classroom. No acoustical treatment or anything else that acknowledges the what's happening in that room, as opposed to a room or an art room that's just a classroom that's been commandeered to be an art room, as opposed to one that's been designed to be an art room. So there are things like that, design, space, and just upgrading systems, old systems. There are some systems I know that it's increasingly difficult to get parts for, when there's something goes wrong. So it's a combination. I suspect, the district has been very prudent in putting together a capital reserve fund, so they are in a position to do some work without borrowing, but I suspect that it'll end up with a master plan that will eventually call for some kind of a larger scale proposition.
The solar panels that we're looking at now as being to put on several buildings in the district, how far off is that?
Well, they hit a bump in the road in terms of the method of calculation, as I understand it, that was being used to look at sort of the economic viability of those and the payback periods and those sorts of things. So right now, I think they're in the process of rethinking it. They're still, in general terms, conceptually, with schools in particular, you've got a lot of flat roof space that's just waiting there and not being used for that purpose. It can readily be used, but you need to make sure that you have the right balance of considerations taking into account so that it actually makes sense financially.
Right. So we have about a minute, and what would you like to say to the folks on White Plains after a year here? And it's your time. Say what you like. I've asked my question.
Well, my first impression right off the bat, which was borne out throughout the year, was all kids are good kids. As an educator, you work with kids from all over the place in different situations. So you always start out by saying that. But I have to say that in White Plains, I've been struck by just how friendly and open and generally polite, courteous. Last night I was remarking at the graduation, students were coming across the stage. They would look you in the eye, they'd smile, they'd say hello, they'd give you a firm handshake. That may sound old school and in keeping with my increasingly gray hair, but I don't think it's a small thing. And so I start out by saying, the kids, somebody's doing something right in raising these kids. Wow. Beyond that, I just think there are a lot of great opportunities that lie ahead.
Well, Dr. Howard Smith, you have been heard, and thank you for giving us a year at White Plains as acting superintendent. John Bailey, good night for People to be Heard.